Thanks, Molly, and thank you to everyone at Open Mouth for setting this up, and especially making sure that this space is accessible. I think it sets a really good precedent for future programming. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to include a link to a PowerPoint so it is easier for folks to follow along the different exercises, especially since I'll be talking a lot. And since it's a larger group anticipated, I want to make sure that this space feels intimate. We won't have a chance to, verbally introduce ourselves. So if you could introduce yourself in the chat, your name, your pronouns, and where you're currently based or from. And if you're on Indigenous land, I will ask if you could make a land acknowledgement. And what that means is just acknowledging that the land that you may be inhabiting has historically been and continues to be land that where Indigenous communities reside. And there's a link to a website called native-land.ca, which tells you which Indigenous land you're on. So you just take a moment to do that. That would be great. So I'm going to include that in the chat. So I will introduce myself first under this format. My name is Muriel Leung, and my pronouns are she and they. And I am currently in Nebraska City, Nebraska, which is Ochete Sakowin land. And but my home base right now is in Oakland, California, which is Ohlone land.
Can you spell that? This is the interpreter. Can you spell that? The name of your land?
Yes, give me 1 second. This is, and thank you, Wes. Yeah, so go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat throughout this workshop. Let's see, I'm going to share screen now. Okay, feel free, the program leads to unmute and tell me if someone wants to say something or can't see and want to make a comment about anything throughout, because I can't see everyone's chat. I can't see everyone's screens when it's a full screen right now. So this is our ghost Stalk the Page. And this workshop came out of a workshop series that I did recently, earlier this year. And what inspired it was thinking about just what it means to write during the pandemic, where we are in the middle of this global health crisis and a constant state of emergency. And what a lot of people have expressed and what I've heard, myself included, is that it's just a very hard time to write, and many people are feeling blocked. And it's also, a time of deep introspection too. A lot of things are coming up for us. But I also think it's a period that calls us to generate something in a different way. Because what it's pointing out to, when we are facing such large amounts of violence and rapidity, is that there are ghosts that we have to contend with. And ghosts are something that I think a lot about in our writing. So the question for this workshop is, what ghosts stalk your writing? And as writers, we're told that poetry is supposed to reveal everything, but what about experiences of ours that's too difficult to put into words? What are some experiences that perhaps ask us to approach things in a different way? And so this workshop is focused on the idea of erasure, which I think is something that is politically laden. And I want us to think through how we could use it as a way to think through ghosts and what haunts our work, and also the political ramifications of them. So just in preparation for this workshop, just so you all get things ready for yourselves. Every writing will ask you to do is will be helpful if you use a Google document or word processor. So you can use Microsoft Word if you don't have Google document. You can use Notes. If you don't want to use electronic writing, that's fine, but I think it'll be easier if you do. And then we'll also be reading an excerpt from Laura Mimosa Montez's Thresholds, which is an incredible book that I hope that you all get to read eventually. And it is in this folder, in this link here. And of course, if you have access to the PowerPoint, then you can also connect to it as well. So to start, I wanted to start with this question that is pretty, that is pretty loaded. I want us to just take a couple of minutes to just reflect on what ghosts haunt our writing. So when I think about ghosts, I think about certain experiences that I keep coming back to, things that I find are hard to write about or that I can't, or on the other end of things, like if that I can't stop writing about, things that I keep returning to. And these are topics that can be emotionally heavy, perhaps. So think about like what ghosts haunt your writing, what's unsaid or that you keep returning to, um, and take a moment to write some of that down. And let's take about 5 minutes to do that. Um, and then if folks want to share, they can share. And if not, I can talk more about that too. So take about 5 minutes to jot down what ghosts haunt your writing.
Hi, I don't understand the last question. I don't get it.
So yes, thank you for that question. The question is not about the last question. So I think about ghosts in two ways. So ghosts are things that either you have a hard time writing about or things that you keep coming back to and you're trying to figure out in your writing. So when I say what haunts your work but does not exist on the page, what are some things that's almost like a third thing. So what is something that you've been trying to write about, but that you haven't yet because you haven't found a way to it? So to clarify, thinking about ghosts as something that you are struggling to write about, something that you keep coming back to, or something that you keep writing about, but you haven't quite gotten there yet. You haven't gotten to the core of it yet. Things that haunt your writing. Does that make sense? Or does it clarify a little bit more for you?
Yeah, I'll just try to listen. I'll listen to it. I don't want to interrupt people. I'm sorry.
No, you're okay. Thank you for asking that question. And I think I can give some examples too if it helps thinking about ghosts. So,
I was gonna ask you.
yeah, yeah, of course. So for me, the ghost in my writing, and I wrote, about books about them. The ghosts that haunt my writing are things I'm writing about familial trauma, for example, writing about histories about my family that I don't necessarily have access to, people who've passed, but that I hear stories passed on from my mother or my father. And so there's a lot of holes there, but I know that they impact me in certain ways. I just don't quite know exactly how. I just know that I keep writing about them and I know it impacts me in my present day, but there's a lot that's still missing there, right? There's a lot I don't know. Um, there are things that I experience as a woman, femme, queer person, Asian American person, experiences that some people don't have access to. those everyday experiences, the things that go on in my mind when I encounter, an act of violence. And I wonder, does anyone else believe me? Does anyone also experience this? Um, these are things that, these are experiences that maybe some people don't have access to, that maybe I haven't even found the words to say yet. But I know it's important to me to write about, or that I keep coming back to. So I think about ghosts in that way, things that you keep coming back to that you may be struggling to write about. I hope
Thank
that's
you.
examples, yeah, for clarifying. Yeah, of course. Thank you for asking. I know it's a very abstract question too, and I could clarify it a bit more. I wonder if, and folks can keep writing, but if anyone wants to share some things that they've come up with, if you feel comfortable sharing, and you can unmute yourself to do so. What goes haunt your writing? It's also okay if you don't want to share it this time too. Um, but I ask you this question just to hold it in your mind, because I think it's something important to reflect on, right? Especially during this time, especially if there are certain things we're experiencing in terms of writing blocks. Um, just what are things you keep coming back to? What are things you struggle to write? Um, think of them as ghosts. Think of them as something that's there, that's not quite there, and think about how you might want to engage with it. Okay.
Muriel, I don't know if you're seeing in the chat, but
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
people are, Melissa says abandonment, Patrick says shame, Lee
Mm.
says homeland in a sense of belonging or origin. Ali says the failures of my language. Sophia, happy to share a bit, younger spirit of my mother, a future self in conversation with ancestral past, the presence of earth that surrounds me, what connects my heart to that of a beloved's, Eros, or the spirit of Eros. David says expectations of attachment to particular persons or people or to the world.
Wow, that's amazing. Pamela says mortality. Wow, this is really rich. Thank you. Shelby also says mortality. Gwen says my mother. Gabby says memorialization. Alexis, uh, daughterhood. Yeah. So a lot about family here, a lot about what does it mean to be alive? What does death and grief mean? Um, and a lot about youth connection to the earth, to nature, um, feelings of abandonment, shame. Octavia says survival, lost community, communication, the ways we've changed, the ways we've stayed the same. Deb says certain sounds of the desert, cicadas, thunder, rain, the hum of sprinklers. Shelby says, what came before me. That's beautiful. Yes, and please keep sharing. The unfortunate thing I haven't figured out about Zoom is how to have shared screen and also a whole conversation at the same time. So if like open mouth folks, if you could just always just give me a heads up if someone said saying something in the chat or raising their hand, that would I'll definitely stop and recalibrate. Thank you. Yeah, so you've all brought up some really rich things about different ways in which ghosts have haunted your writing. And so I want you to just hold on to that for a time being, because I think these are things that are important to notice about your work. And as we go on to talk about experimentations or form, especially erasure, I want us to think about how we can represent that in our work. So when I say experimentations with form, I mean that this is, you know, we have the content of our work, right? And when we talk about form, we're talking about the shape that your writing takes. So when we're using erasure, there are different forms. Well, erasures and also different forms that we can play with experimentations with text. And these are the ways I want us to think about how we can represent our various ghosts. So we had time today, I would have shown an excerpt from Jenny Booley's The Body and Essay, which is a book-length work that utilizes footnotes. So it's an entire work that's comprised of footnotes. So I want us to think about, I would ask us to think about why you would represent your work in footnote forms. What do footnotes mean for you? You know, and how is it different than writing something in the larger body of a text? We're going to look at visual text today through Laura Mimosa Montez's Thresholds. And you'll see in her text that there are certain literal holes that's embodied throughout her text. And then there's fragmented prose throughout. So I want us to think about why she chooses to represent her ghosts that way, and what does it say about the content of the work that she's exploring. And other experimentations with form include different forms of erasures. So redactions, you know, one way that happens is, you know, the blacking out of text, so you can't see certain pieces of text. Strikeouts, which is like lines through text, so you can see what's visible, but it's struck out. Whiteouts, which you know, are white blank spaces in text. And then white space in text, you know, when there's like large gaps of a blank space throughout a body of a text. These are different ways in which we can visually experiment with the poem on the page, and ways in which we can play with this idea of ghosts, right? So we're talking about things that are keep coming up for us, and we're trying to think beyond just what happens in words. These are different ways in which we can visually represent our ghosts. So I just wanted us to hold on to that for a moment there. And just a quick check-in too, because I'm sure that there are people with different writing experiences in the group. I just want to see if this is a concept that folks are, I just want to make sure that this is a concept that folks are clear on, or if there's something that's like not clear that I can expand on. So when I say experimentations with form, folks feel good about that? Okay, cool. Always happy to clarify, need be. Okay. So before we get into it, I want us to look at something that Sama Sharif writes about erasure, specifically about how, I think this is a great excerpt that talks about erasure and the political implications of it. And I think it's a good example of us thinking about how we use how we use formal experimentation, right? So anytime that we visually alter something about a poem, especially if we're taking something out, it does have a political implication, even as we're exploring something personal, right? And for her, you know, she's talking about her relationship to erasure and state violence. Like, how do you exercise erasure on the page if your experience, especially with state violence, is that things are silenced regularly for you, especially in language. So how do you contend with this piece of craft or writing if the association has been with violence? So if this workshop is asking you to visually alter text, especially if you're dealing with experiences that are heavy or deal with violence in some way in your life, how can you make visual formal experimentation something that you feel ownership with and doesn't replicate certain harms? So for her, I'll read this aloud from an essay called "The Near Transitive Properties of the Political and Poetical Erasure." She writes, "The first time I confronted erasure as an aesthetic tactic, I was horrified. I don't remember exactly when or what it was. I know I was in the United States. I know it was an erasure undertaken by a poet of the United States. I know it was after the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, after extraordinary rendition, and disappeared men flown to secret sites in Somalia, certainly after attempted annihilation, indigenous languages and peoples after the enforced illiteracy of Black slaves, certainly after Deir Yassin and the establishment too of this settler colonial nation. I know I thought of erasure as what a state does. Let's stick with this initial horror for now. After all, the proliferation of erasure as a poetic tactic in the United States is happening alongside a proliferation of our awareness of it as a state tactic. And it seems many erasure projects today hold these things as unrelated. Still, when it comes to erasure, this very form of palimpsest, the ghost is not only death or the degradations of time, the ghost is the state itself. So I pointed this excerpt because I think it's very interesting that this is a way of looking at a form of formal experimentation as ghost. And the idea of the palimpsest, right, is the idea that even if you erase something, you're also pointing to, you also see residues of what's been erased. So the thing that's erased is never entirely disappeared. And that is exactly what happens with state violence. If state violence is the idea that you eradicate like whole histories or people, you're undermining the resiliency of certain communities and the ability to of these communities to find other ways of persisting and having voice. And so that's the spirit in which I want us to think about our work today, and whatever we produce is that even as we're experimenting with formal experimentation, in which we're altering text, in which we may be erasing, striking out, or redacting, to find a way to do it in such a way in which you find power in it, even as you're, especially as you're talking about difficult experiences in your writing. So let's look at Laura Mimosa Montez's thresholds together. There's a link here in the PowerPoint, and we're only going to read aloud 2 pages from it. And because of time, I think I'll read that out loud, and just we'll talk very briefly about it. Let's see if I can pull that up for you all. Or let me put the link in the chat.
We've got it in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Perfect.
if anyone wants to, there's the PDF and a Google Doc in the chat.
Perfect, thank you. Let me see if I can. Can everyone see this okay? Or is it, can I make it bigger? I don't know. Okay, good, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so this is from Lara Mimosa Montez's Thresholds. So just a visual description of this. There's fragments of poetic text, and then in between are the visual representation of holes, hollowed out holes that somewhat punctuate the white space between the text. So in this opening, we have 3 holes that precedes the opening text, and it goes like this. Once you spoke without an accent, as if you came from nowhere. Nowhere is not a place, it is a modulation, a throbbing we carry within us, a process, unremitting. It was sequential until it wasn't, and open to what is adjacent. In the red notebook I carry always, a blank 25-cent postcard of Silver Rock, Cannon Beach, Oregon, a small black and white photograph of a cattle crossing taken from behind the dashboard of a car facing the oncoming cattle caravan, and another postcard featuring an image of the seaside city of Atami, part of Asako Narahashi's series, half awake and half asleep in the water. The barren coastal scene captured in the postcard of Silver Rock resembles the beaches of Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal and suggests a despair of a spiritual origin, while the others, oncoming catastrophe by way of some fatal accident, such as death by stampede or drowning. I have never, to the best of my recollection, been subject to a Rorschach test, not as a child, not as an adult, but trust that if there is a life for me to be lived between these images, then these words would be my attempt to describe it. There where the violence is, inside the soft tissue holding, wildflowers like wild parts of me, always desiring and unfolding to speak of you beyond the rewriting, but how without a body. Okay. So there's a lot happening, right, in these few pages, and this might be, text I wish that we had a little bit more time to read through more carefully. But I just want to get a sense from everyone too, like what's themes emerge for you so far in this text? What tones or feelings do you pick up on? Because a lot of it is sort of gesture too, right? It's like if we ask the question, what is happening? There's a lot that's happening. But what sort of feeling do you get? Okay, so Marina says, yes, the feeling of death. Mhm. So there's some allusion to some passing here, right? What else? What else? Or if you want to say more, what gives you the feeling of a death happening? Page. Okay, there's a gesture to film. Sophia says the form makes it feel like transitions between different scenes in a film. Okay. Thank you, Gwen, for typing the question. Yeah, the long incongruous stretch of dropped names and references to obsolete but famous psychological techniques suggest an insecurity, fear of death, a felt need to give reasons, uncertainty. It's how we think, white spaces for time to process what was said, thought. Yeah, so there's a processing that's happening. There's a trying to, everyone's sort of picking up on the author trying to figure, or the speaker trying to figure something out. Do we have a sense of what she's puzzling through? How to put language around that? Yeah. And why might this be something that's hard to put language to? Mhm. There's a language of fragmentation here. Language is social, nothing is sub-social. I want us to go to page 2 where it says we're pointing to a gesture to there where violence is, right? And this comes after a description of coastal scene of a postcard, description of an image. But we don't get, a play-by-play of what the violence is, right? Tina says it seems like the speaker is thinking through someone else's experience. Alexis says embodiment must be felt. And Tina says the first you. Okay, so there's a sense of removal here. Okay. Deb says, do the number of symbols, sometimes one, sometimes several, reflect how much content is withheld? So that's interesting to note, right? So there's information that's being withheld here, right? Even as something heavy is being alluded to, something as heavy as, when you say violence in a text, that really grabs your attention. But so far we haven't seen anything that's an explicit, like violent description yet, right? We do get this description, right, of an image. And then we get these fragments that kind of point to different images of the body. We get, and other people have noted this feeling of death, of uncertainty, of trying to process through something perhaps difficult. And this is happening through fragments, right? So I want us to think about this work and what it's doing, right? We know that there's something underlying the surface, and we know it's happening through fragments of text. And we also know that there's a visual representation of it through these symbol of holes, right? So if something is being said in holes that we don't get via text, and this is the way in which Laura Mimosa Montez decides to represent a certain experience that she's exploring. Yamini says, it feels like the speaker is processing trauma and they are feeling disembodied from themselves. And David says, the poem is itself violating readerly expectation, quote unquote, there could be, not least the immediately preceding whole glyph itself. Yes, definitely to all of that. Yeah, there's definitely something being alluded to here. And, as you read on, you'll have more information. And I wanted to point out that, the holes give us as much information as what's written out via text, right? So I want us to think about how powerful the representation of what's not being said is, just as much as what is being said. And I hope that that is the spirit we carry with us into how we might want to explore our work. So I apologize for moving rather quickly, but I know we are, I want us to make sure we have time for everything. So do read on. I really highly recommend reading Thresholds for an example of visual representation of ghosts in text. But I want us to make sure that we have time for this exercise. So what I have here is a link to a piece of text. And what I will ask you all to do is, this isn't a way to experiment with visual experimentations of form. I'm going to ask you to copy and paste the link text into a new document so you can play around with it. And what you're going to do is you're going to take the text and apply one or more of the following experimentation techniques that we talked about in the previous slide. You can feel free to add or modify any of the sentences as you deem fit. So you can, here are some different things you can do. You can take out sentences. You can use white space. You can use any form of erasure. So redaction, you can black out certain texts. You can strike out. You can white out certain texts. You can think about a visual representation of a ghost or something that haunts the page. So if Laura Mimosa Montes uses holes, think about what that might mean for you. You might want to invent something different entirely for you and modify the text according to that visual. You might even want to play with footnotes too. You can put some text in footnotes. You can write your own footnotes into the main body of the text. So let's take about 7 minutes to play around with this text. And we'll come back and maybe we have like one volunteer to show what they've done and talk a little bit about that. We'll take about 1 more minute. So I know we didn't have a lot of time for this writing exercise, and that's my fault for poor time management. But does anyone want to maybe share their screen and maybe show what they've been able to work on in terms of their writing? It'd be nice to see an example of what somebody will come up with. Yes, and Gwen says that they can make you a co-host to share the screen if you'd want to. So if there's something that you've been working on, it doesn't have to be finished. If you wanted to share, just to give an example. Shelby says that she can. Is it okay to make her co-host so she can share the screen? Okay, Shelby, whenever you're ready. Drop a screenshot. I think you can. Pamela says something about a screenshot. I think you can if you attach a file.
Okay,
To.
let me see.
Let's see.
Sorry, I don't know how to do screen. Oh, there we go. I could screen share.
Yeah, it's on the bottom of the screen. It says, there you go. Cool. Okay, do you want to read it out loud?
Sure. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. I subtract myself so much. Dull, fear. Now I want its opposite. Once she listened, she stirred. I thought cloaked in the day, a loose pile is a type of surrender.
Ooh, thank you so much for that. Do you want to talk a little bit about the form of erasure or visual experimentation you chose?
Sure. I love using erasure. I find it really powerful in terms of unlocking my imagination and like putting me in a direction that maybe I wouldn't know or think to. Obviously it was really quick that we had to do this. So I sort of just let which I think in some cases is good so you don't have a chance to overthink. But I used whiteout, I think is the method, right?
Yeah.
And I haven't had much time to think about it. But yes, I think I sort of didn't read the text as much as just use my imagination and what words stuck out to me and like the message, I guess, in my subconscious that I was trying to get across. Yeah, I haven't had much time to process it. So I think does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, I just reading through it, it feels very complete too. And what you're describing feels like you tapping into a certain intuition about the words, because, you know, it in a sorry, I muted myself by accident. So I was saying that it feels really complete to me. And what I get the sense of what you're saying is that you tapped into your intuition about certain words. So even if you didn't read through it and you didn't, process what the original text meant or was trying to convey, I do see words, certain words that you chose to emphasize and keep in this. And I think that altogether it creates a different type of text than the original. And that's the point, right? Is to change something, but to draw attention to this other quality of the words, which I think you did incredibly well. So thank you for offering this example of using whiteout and blank space.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I think I would love to see different examples, but I think we don't have time. If you do want to share, I definitely recommend, taking a screenshot, and you can add it via the file button in the chat. Yeah, and to keep practicing these exercises in your own time. I will one last thing so that I can share screen is I wanted to offer a last prompt for you all to work on in your own time, which is to and this is something that if you want to write a poem after this, you can. I hope you do. Is to write a poem that's a list of secrets about you, other people, what you know about nature, and then pick one form of erasure, or some other type of visual experimentation and apply it to the poem. So in Shelby's example, using white space and a white out was a way of applying a certain erasure. So if you were to write a poem that's a list of secrets, and then you were to go back and apply a form of erasure, what would that look like? So I offer you this prompt, and then the last thing that I like for us to do, because we, talked about some heavy things today, is to take 3 big breaths together. So first breath, breathe in, hold it for a second, and exhale out. Next breath, a bigger breath than before. Take a big breath in, hold it for a beat, and breathe out. And the last breath, the biggest breath you can take it all the way in. Hold it, and then breathe out. I wish that we had more time to talk today. I feel like everyone's ideas were just so compelling and so interesting, and I wish I could talk to you all more in person. But I hope that you all continue to experiment with these different forms in your own writing, and to take care of your writing, especially as we're going through this time where we're experiencing a lot of creative blockages, and to know that this is a time that calls for us to approach our work differently. So I hope that you find ways that work for you, and that you keep trying to speak through these silences and the harder topics that call to us and that haunt us in our work.